Okay to start? Yeah. Okay, so we'll get started. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good lunch. Okay, so welcome to this final paper session of the conference. And we have two papers here, Louisa Morgan followed by Ben McPherson. I'll introduce Louisa first of all and then Ben when it comes to that point. So Louisa is a valued member of the PGR community here in Guildford School of Acting at the University of Surrey, and her research interest is in emotion and the voice. She is a lecturer for the voice. Right, voice. I'll move back a bit. Yeah, the Voice Studies Centre and a private voice acting and singing coach. She's taught singing to musical theatre students here at GSA and at Talia Conti, and also at the Signet Training Theatre. She has a master's degree in vocal pedagogy, a 3-year diploma in acting and directing, and a BA Hons in English and Literary Studies. And the title of Louisa's paper is, as I say, Affective Athleticism in the Vocal Athlete Performing Emotional Roles. Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody. Thank you to Barbara for organising and for being so welcoming at this conference. It's been really wonderful. And there are some themes that you may notice that we've seen already this week, particularly on Wednesday, that are very similar. So hopefully, you can see some crossovers there. So I'd like to start by defining the term vocal athlete, because it's become popular when describing the vocal demands of singers, particularly in the field of musical theatre recently. And of course, this is partly because of the multidisciplinary nature of the work, with the expectation that they need to sing, speak, dance, and act. But it is also because of the more specific vocal demands, which are relevant to all stage singing. But the muscularity and the agility of the vocal expectations themselves are part of this vocal athleticism. We expect our musical theatre singers to work with a really wide vocal range, extremes in terms of volume, vocal agility like riffing, and much more muscular vocal qualities like belt. And that muscularity is really significant for us here in terms of the vocal athlete. The vocal load should be considered as part of this athleticism, including both the duration of the performance as well as the number of rehearsals, the number of performances per day and per week. For musical theatre, the vocal demands have also increased significantly over the last 30 years. Belting in musical theatre, for example, traditionally reached around a C or a D5 for female vocalists, but shifts in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, particularly through the influence of pop, which of course always informs musical theatre trends to some degree, have forced the belt to rise. And it regularly now reaches far beyond this, with the expectation that female vocalists must know how to navigate a belt up to around an F or a G5. While gospel singers have been achieving this for decades, it is a very different muscular and acoustic coordination to what we are used to in traditional musical theatre belt. And this is also an example of the expectation that singers will perform in multiple subgenres, meeting the demands of each one. And of course, musical theatre covers pop, folk, rock, others. It includes the legit vocal style, which, while very different, does have some similarities to Western classical sound production. And each of these has its own demand, and a performer may need to have the muscular coordination to move very quickly, actually, between each subgenre as needed. And while we make this comparison to athletes regularly, our stage performers are rarely afforded the same rest and recovery strategies as sports performers, such as in-house massage therapists or in-house health specialists. Further, while it is commonplace for athletes to need to have surgery and to take breaks for injury, musical theatre vocalists are regularly surrounded by stigma, bullying, and pay-docking cultures when it comes to vocal health. Moving on to defining the affective athleticism. So these demands that I've just mentioned are already likely to place significant pressure on the performer, which may impact general stress levels and create psychological challenges for some singers. This is fairly widely documented in terms of the industry-related pressures involved in the job uncertainty, navigating secondary jobs, financial uncertainty, regular relocation, touring, and so on. But what is less thoroughly explored is the impact of the emotional life of the character on the performer's voice, particularly during high-intensity negative valence emotions, which is where my research sits. Negative valence emotions are known to have specific responses in the body and in the voice, and they have been associated with stronger autonomic responses than positive valence emotions. Stress and fear responses can trigger the sympathetic nervous system, preparing the body for active response. And coming to the quote on the screen here, Artaud referred to affective athleticism in his seminal work, The Theatre and Its Double, writing, "An actor is like a physical athlete, with this astonishing corollary. His affective organism is similar to the athlete's, being parallel to it like a double, although they do not act on the same level." And Coxey writes that Artaud intends for his actors to orchestrate the audience's emotional responses through their movement, gesture, and breath. Similarly, Alfred Wolfson, who we've already heard about this week, was a pioneer of extended vocal technique, and he suffered from vocal hallucinations as part of post-traumatic stress from the First World War. He connected the voice to emotion through athleticism. An article in The Observer from 1956 described Wolfson's approach in this way. Mr. Wolfson does not regard the voice as a delicate plant to be carefully cultivated, but rather as a potential athlete in need of strict but thorough, strenuous training. He uses a kind of assault course technique, and the voice certainly seems to be capable of putting up an astonishing performance. And Wolfson referred to the voice as the muscle of the soul. But for both Artaud and for Wolfson, the emotional voice needs to be worked with and trained. And this is far beyond our traditional technical vocal training, and it must specifically target emotional athleticism. So let's take a moment to look at the potential impact of negative emotion on the voice user. There are a number of physiological effects of emotion on the voice. They may include, as a selection, increased heart rate, so cardiovascular stimulation, which has a respiratory impact. We can lose control of the breath flow and the breath pressure. We have increased muscular activation in muscles around the neck, in the jaw, in the larynx, in the shoulders, in the abdomen. And all of this additional increased activation can again impact our respiratory muscles and also our vocal and articulatory systems. We can have pressed phonation due to the firmer focal fold adduction and a longer closed phase. The increased articulation that we experience is involuntary increased articulation, and it's directly due to jaw and tongue engagement, and this can impact our vocal agility as well as increasing vocal effort and potential strain. We can also experience the globus pharyngeus sensation, the feeling of the lump in the throat that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that can happen just before we cry. And it's caused by a constriction of the muscles of the pharynx. And while there are specific vocal exercises that do engage a sob or a cry position intentionally in the vocal tract for technical reasons, if the performer is working with high-intensity negative emotion, that may lead to real feelings of sadness, real feelings of grief or despair. We need to consider this unwanted constriction of the pharyngeal muscles may occur. So all of these effects are sometimes known in emotion research as push effects, these being the physiological elements of the emotion that are automatic reactions. They can happen as a result of what you might consider real emotion as well as performed emotion, which has triggered the physiological effects of real emotion. A recent article by King and Williams on laryngeal guarding may offer a little bit of insight into what's happening in the larynx when we're experiencing emotion in some cases. While they are speaking much more about a habitual response to previous injury, in the same way as we might guard parts of our body that have been injured, leading to a maladaptive response, some of their findings may carry over. Their discussion of anticipated anxiety or anticipated fear is particularly relevant here, as they state in this quote, "When it comes to the anticipation of pain, guarding can be conceptualized as the expression of sensorimotor priors that have been shaped by previous noxious or affective experiences and stored in autobiographical memory." And it's this autobiographical memory that's particularly significant. The author suggests that the guarding of the larynx is a specific response of the adductor reflex, which activates as a response to protect the airway. And they state it is controlled entirely by the brainstem and not the thinking brain. So it may be that some of the laryngeal constriction that's felt during emotional performance is part of the body's learned response to previous experiences of those emotions, albeit within a different context. So this also means that a performer who has experienced vocal challenges with emotional performances in the past, or, significantly, who has experienced vocal health challenges through personal difficulties, may be more likely to experience difficulties with vocal health in emotional roles. So, coming to the very complicated question of can we separate real and acted emotion? The embodied emotion theory suggests that we map the emotions of others onto ourselves to understand emotion. Neurons in the visual, auditory, and emotion systems are activated in response to both being in specific situations and thinking about them. Experiencing and processing emotion is both in the body and in the mind and can be reenacted by emotional memory. And the more I spend time learning about emotion from a psychological perspective and from the perspectives of neuroscience, as well as from a somatic perspective, I understand that the body and the mind, if we can separate them at all, which I'm not convinced that we can, struggles to tell the difference between real and acted emotion in certain scenarios. So performing emotion can trigger physiological stress responses, particularly in negative valence emotion. Even thinking about an emotional experience can create an emotional reaction. As Kuhl writes, anticipating an emotional experience leads to a partial simulation of that experience, in which emotional responses of the brain and the body become activated. So while cognitively we can know that the emotion is acted, depending on your definition of an emotional experience, there can be, at times, little difference between real and performed emotion once these physiological responses have been triggered, and it's that bit that matters. And this also means that performance strategies that aim to use body-based triggers to avoid real emotion are actually not likely to be helpful in reality for many people with certain backgrounds and experiences. Some authors think of emotional experience as separated into cognitive and embodied ideas in an abstract way. Tate talks about cognitive ideas as the director's domain, working with the cognitive emotional ideas offered by the writer and translating this into embodied expression with the performers. She ascribes embodied feeling to the performer who takes the cognitive ideas and translates them. The mood is shaped by the creative expression of the composer and the lighting designer. The audience responds to all three, understanding the cognitive ideas offered by the writer through the text, the embodied feeling felt in sympathy with the performer, and the atmospheric mood cultivated by the composer and the designer. There are, therefore, many interconnected strands to consider when approaching the performer's role in the emotional experience of theatre. But while this is a really useful breakdown for a kind of zoomed-out emotional experience in theatre, the separation of cognitive and emotional experience for the actor in their own bodies is not a simple split. And the well-being challenges that can result from this blurring of boundaries between real and performed emotion need to be considered. So how much is voluntary or involuntary in the voice and the brain? McGettigan and Scott tell us that emotional outbursts like crying, laughing, and swearing, in fact, belong to separate systems in the brain from linguistic content. We also know that emotion is overlaid on top of linguistic content, which can lead to conflicts in the brain between voluntary and involuntary sound production. So this means that emotion can override our vocal control. And I'm sure we've all experienced that sensation of trying to speak while suppressing laughter or suppressing tears, and have felt that loss of vocal control discussed here. So as performers, we need to regulate this as a possibility and to prepare for that possibility vocally. But we also need to display these kinds of outbursts as a depiction of emotion. So it's important for us to understand it from both sides. So some challenges for performers to consider. First of all, emotional hijacking. So this is where the person loses control because of the emotion overriding the system in the way that McGettigan and Scott were talking about. And this, of course, is one of the common criticisms of using emotional memory or affective memory. And it's essentially an issue of emotion regulation. The primary emotional response is not regulated, and therefore an up-regulation happens rather than a down-regulation. Emotional hangover, this is when that emotion carries over from the performed emotion into the rest of the day. This is the impact of emotional hijacking. We can also have the inability to access the emotion. This may be through difficulty performers find in terms of seeking the emotional experience, regardless of the thoughts that you have of actors digging around to find an emotional feeling. This is something that we sometimes come across. But it can also be because they fear the emotional hijacking or they fear the emotional hangover. So this also leads us to ask the question of whether or not the singer needs to experience the emotion at all in order for the audience to be moved. Caring for our performers. This is really my main focus. So staying with cool for a moment, negative emotional states are costly because they mobilize a wide array of mental and physical resources within the individual. When working with performers on emotional roles, we are inviting them to open themselves to experiences that may raise personal associations, even if this is not our intention. While my primary focus is on negative valence emotions, it is worth noting that even positive emotions can have surprising effects and take us off guard. As coaches or as training providers, we have a duty of care for our performers. And I've noticed a surprising lack of discussion about emotional material within pedagogy ahead of working with that emotional material. So this comes to where I am in my research at the moment. I'm about halfway through a large project. And at this stage, I've just completed some interviews with some vocal health practitioners to gain a much more detailed perspective on the topic from medical professionals with experience specifically of working with high-intensity negative emotions in musical theatre performers. So we had a mix of speech and language therapists, voice rehabilitation coaches, but they all had experience of working in clinics and with high-level musical theatre performers. So that's who I interviewed, and questions surrounded emotion and vocal health. Thematic analysis was used with a process of the typical familiarization, coding, and theme development, and 3 groups of themes were eventually created. We had a main set for discussion, which is what you can see on the screen here, and then 2 other sets of risks and strategies. So staying with the main themes for a moment, we have The Show Will Go On, which covers industry-related pressures, including things like stigma, bullying, and pay docking. And of course, we heard about this earlier in the week in relation to the opera world. In musical theatre currently, particularly from what I'm aware in the UK, there are still to this day some significant issues with this, which cropped up a lot in the interviews. Teaching preparation, advice and behaviour, so this very much comes to the training aspect. Who can or should help? So there were many discussions around roles, professional boundaries and interdisciplinary communication. And something that a lot of the vocal health professionals noted was that performers just didn't know who to go to. when it comes to this issue. Do I go to my acting coach? Probably not, because it may connect to something that's going on in terms of my own mental health. And do I talk about that? Maybe not. Do I go to my singing teacher? Probably not. Who is going to give me the strategies? And some of these vocal health professionals were finding that they were landed at their by the time that they came to them with the task of dealing with all of this enormous conversation, which is often outside of their bounds as well. The intensity level matters. So this looks at how emotional intensity impacts effort levels and vocal health, but also, on the flip side, how intensity levels can be used as part of a management strategy. Who needs to feel the emotion? This came up again a lot in our conversations. So this explores that complex relationship between performer and audience. Who is the person who needs to feel it? And then the fine line between real and acted emotion. And this particularly lovely phrase came up of shaking off the emotional coat. How do we shake off the emotional coat? And it really comes back to this idea of emotion regulation and down-regulating, which is part of the cool-down process, and again is often forgotten as part of our practice. We then moved on to possible strategies, and I don't have time to go through all of these. This is very much where we're heading, but it came into the categories of training. So what can coaches and training providers do to help? Something that came up a lot was reflective practices, so including some of those emotion regulation strategies through things like meditation, journaling, and other practices. But of course, if we're going to step into those areas, we need to do this carefully, and we need to do this with an understanding of professional boundaries, and we mustn't take these ideas lightly. When it comes to voice and breath, these were very specific techniques raised by the practitioners, some of which you would be familiar with. And then coming to psychological and general well-being. And again, what can we do to care for the whole performer and their whole well-being outside of just voice, and whose responsibility is it? Somatic and whole body strategies came up a lot, including practices like yoga. And then we talked about performed emotion strategies, very specific to dealing with the emotional aspect of performance. So what's next? So these interviews were just part of stage one, which also includes reviewing a wide range of interdisciplinary literature from the fields of psychology, neuroscience, voice science, and practitioner literature. Oh, I've lost a page, sorry. My next phase will involve the development of a workshop which is going to be trialled with a group of pre-professional musical theatre performers here at GSA and developed through participatory action research. And the aim is to create a workshop that can be used to help performers find specific strategies for working with emotional roles while caring for their vocal health and their emotional well-being without losing artistic integrity and while meeting the high vocal demands required by the industry. And the ultimate goal is to empower performers not to be just vocal athletes, but affective athletes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louisa. Thank you. Okay. So our second speaker, Ben McPherson. So Ben McPherson is a reader in vocal theatres at the University of Portsmouth, and he works at the intersection between musical theatre and interdisciplinary voice studies, which has been a pioneering work in that field, along with Konstantinos Tomidis, really for sort of at least a decade. I'm not going to list all of the publications, there are many, but I'll just single out in particular most recent book, Singing Utopia, Voice in Musical Theatre, which was published in 2024, and before that, Cultural Identity in British Musical Theatre, 1890 to 1939. It was published in 2018. So he's also the founding co-editor of the Journal of Interdisciplinary Voice Studies and the Routledge Voice Studies book series, and principal investigator for the project Musical Theatre on Record, which is funded by the AHRC since 2020. So Ben's paper for us now is called Voicing Time and Place, a cappella as a bleak vocality in musical theatre.
All right, so while I fall down with technology, my thanks to Barbara for the invitation. oh, do you know what? That might have worked. I don't do max. This is okay, here we go.
It is often said that time and tide wait for no man, and I suppose in this case that's still true. But in this case, a most curious case, time and tide behaved a little differently.
So sing the ensemble at the top of the 2024 London staging of the musical The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by Darren Clarke and Jethro Compton, adapted from the short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald, in which the main character ages backwards. Unusual, perhaps, for a Western musical to begin in Cornish, the area of Britain to which the musical is relocated from its original source material. Unusual, too, albeit not without precedent, for a musical to begin with unaccompanied voices. So we might go back to 1904, Little Johnny Jones, George M. Cohen's Revue on Broadway. We might go to 1943 and Oklahoma, but it's still a rare thing in popular musical theatre. But through this ensemble a cappella opening, the musical begins by asking a series of questions in Cornish, which, broadly speaking, translates into English as the following. I take no credit for this translation. This is from the authors. But what is home? The coast of old Cornwall? Is home the song of the wind or the cliffs? I'll set my course and my compass for home. In this paper, I want to consider the relationship between a cappella voice, home, environment, and personal identity in musical theatre performance. And we're going to return to Benjamin Button to do so very shortly. This is drawn from a draft section of my work in progress, which is currently entitled Singing Strangely, Oblique Vocality in Musical Theatre, and it's intended as a companion volume to the recent monograph, as Robert noted, Singing Utopia. And I want to suggest that such an aesthetic as a cappella is rich with the potential to recalibrate and reshape the experience of temporality and the effective weight of belonging and identity in such performances. So doing so, we'll consider two works of musical theatre. Firstly, Benjamin Button, as we've said, and the entirely a cappella 2019 musical Islander. Can you hear me okay? I feel like it's, yeah, okay, good. All right. But first, a brief contextual introduction then to the form. So in their book on a cappella, musical directors Deke Sharon and Dylan Bell offer a simple but profound starting point. Let's do that. Before instruments, there was only the voice. So voice is the original musical instrument, right? Across history, the primacy of the unaccompanied voice has been valued in both sacred and secular contexts, at all times tethered to notions of place, time, and personal identity. So from liturgical or cantorial chant through the call of the adhan in the Islamic tradition, a cappella voice is at times imbued with a sense of divine authority, shaping personal experience, regulating time and place, or demonstrating the intensity of personal religious expression through repetitive meditative utterance. Elsewhere, solo monophony soothes babies and young children as parents or other caregivers sing lullabies, or it arouses the attention of passers-by as street vendors hawk their wares in public places. Collective unaccompanied voices, from the Union picket line to the unruly sounds of the sports stadium, locate lived experience in specific times and places in politics and leisure pursuits, while work songs across time and place ensured that sailors hauled in unison or enslaved peoples gave voice to their circumstances. In popular culture, from the particularized nostalgia of barbershop or doo-wop to the articulation of black urban working class disaffection heard in beatboxing and rap, unaccompanied vocality likewise articulates lived aspects of the human condition with an immediacy unaccessible or inaccessible from other forms. So across all cultures then, the primacy of the unaccompanied voice has long been associated to this strong sense of belonging to place and culture, even if for the first quarter of the 21st century, seen in films like Pitch Perfect or television series like Glee, it has also somewhat been a punchline. The a cappella voice thus invites a focus on cultural and contextual political discourses, allied to musical elements including timbre, shape, gesture, and rhythm. At times, such as in the opening of Benjamin Button, or in the excerpt we heard from Franco Corelli in Matthew's paper earlier, moments of a cappella voice punctuate an otherwise instrumental terrain of what I elsewhere term the voice world of a given production, the aesthetic or sonic cartography of voices in a given work. Elsewhere, albeit more rarely, a cappella voices characterize an entire voice world. So briefly, we're going to consider how, in each case, unaccompanied singing operates to give voice to time, place, and a sense of belonging, beginning with a return to the shoreline of Cornwall and Benjamin Button. So while the absence of musical accompaniment may conventionally be considered a deficit in the horizon of expectation attendant upon popular musical theatre, moments in which unaccompanied voices are foregrounded may in fact be experienced as what musicologist Kofi Agawu has termed high points. Focusing primarily on romantic instrumental music, Agawu defines a high point as a superlative moment, the moment of greatest intensity, of extreme tension, a decisive release, or a turning point in a musical work. Discrete moments of unaccompanied voice may act as specific points of focus or demarcation, often leading to sheer visceral pleasure for an audience, as Carolyn Abate or Peter Keevy have considered in regard to the operatic aria, for example. Such moments may offer such a sudden aesthetic and aural shift that they stand alone against the orchestral world of the work. In this context, they may be surprising or out of place, adjacent to the dominant vocal aesthetic. In other words, to borrow from mathematics or geometry, because we are all STEM scholars now, aren't we? We may consider such voices to be oblique or even strange, from the original English and French etymology, out of place. So when Benjamin Button opens with an a cappella ensemble singing in Cornish, then how are we going to understand what this is doing? In common with Curley's opening declamation of Oklahoma, that there's a bright golden haze on the meadow. Good afternoon. This work evokes a strong sense of place and culture through the folk aesthetic that it evokes. This is a world of oral tradition, of sea shanties arising from marine labour and tethered to this particular coastline. A sensibility that is reinforced in this adaptation through the use of actor musicianship and the third-person narrative by the ensemble to pass the story along. In her work on English folk songs, ethnomusicologist Elizabeth Bennett has considered the ways in which a cappella voices from such oral traditions produce an embodied interaction with their environment, one in which orality becomes a sonic determinant of place and identity. Bennett draws on the work of social anthropologist Sarah Pink to consider a cappella folk song as an embodied form of sensory memory, what she calls imagining in practice. By the way, that was really out of tune. I'm very sorry. Could not find that first pitch. Right. Unaccompanied singing thus becomes an affective practice in which the individual, their identity, and their being are wedded to, or even constitute, their sense of place and environment. Continuing to develop a lexicon for analysing voice in musical theatre, which I initiated in Singing Utopia, from where the word voice world has been derived, I want here to use the concept there we go, of voicescaping, to describe the active way in which voices construct, inhabit, and reshape dramatic environments and temporalities. This concept is a kind of sensorial vocal cartography in response to Dominic Simmons' work on performance cartography, mapping cultural, historical, and affective terrains through sound. But I should note here that Henry Johnson also uses this term with respect to sound studies, but he uses it more particularly with respect to intermediate voices such as street vendors that hawk their wares, the kind of chants that you get in public spaces. I apply it differently here. So in this context, Benjamin Button opens with a collective moment of affective practice as the community asks, what is home? This opening thus engages in an act of voicescaping, mapping the terrain of the musical work around oral traditions tied to identity and belonging, or, putting it more bluntly, to where we might feel at home. Throughout the work, this a cappella chorality returns to oral traditions momentarily through the performance, telling a story increasingly tethered to the wind and the rain and the pub in the little Cornish village. Later in Act 2, following the death of his daughter and unable to cope with his grief, Benjamin goes in search of a cure for his reverse aging. Sat shoreside in Portsmouth, New England, he finds a message in a bottle float to his side. A message from his older and wiser self, written to his wife Eloan, sent out to sea from the harbour in my hometown of Portsmouth, England, when on assignment during World War I. And bearing in mind, he has reversed in age. Reading the letter, Benjamin reflects on where life has taken him.
Like the lines of this ladder to be cast to the sea, I am bound ever onward to roam. But where'er I may wander, where'er I may be, my heart sings the song of my home.
A reprise of the song Home from early in Act 1, the moment is a rare singularity, a solo unaccompanied voice amid a performance of ensemble, community, chorality, and shared vocal and instrumental labour, which in many ways becomes the moment of greatest intensity, as Agawu would put it, in this voice world, as Benjamin performs an epistolary song, singing the letter in an act of what anthropologist Tim Ingold might understand as a dual means of recovery. In his book Being Alive, Ingold writes that to read is not just to listen, but to remember. If writing speaks, it does so with the voices of the past, which the reader hears as though he were present. To provide the pathways along which the voices of the past can be retrieved, allowing readers to connect what they have to say with the circumstances of their own lives. This moment, then, voicescapes Ingold's means of recovery as Benjamin hears his own words from his past. The vocal singularity of this act offers a turning point in which the question posed at the opening by the community, what is home, is answered through an unaccompanied affective act of embodied voicing by the individual. Home is family, place, and memory. So strange, oblique moments of a cappella voice can act as points of focus, voicescaping connections between people, time, and place, woven through voice worlds into turning points, moments of release, or moments of greatest intensity. But what of a musical in which the entire voice world is a cappella, requiring, to refer to our first paper in this panel, great vocal athleticism? In an article by anthropologist Barbara Bender, which relates as easily to Benjamin Button as to the work we'll now consider, she proposes that landscapes, like time, never stand still, and that landscape is time materializing. She also reminds us that both landscape and time are not out there, but subjective. They begin with and belong to us. Okay. Voices, like landscapes, are also a means through which time materializes. They emerge from bodies, unfold in time, extend outward across our lived horizon, connecting us to others and to environments both real and perceived, as Benjamin found out when he discovered that letter floating to his feet. The 2019 musical Islander is a compelling case of how this might be understood in an entirely a cappella work. From a concept by Amy Draper, the musical has a book by Stuart Melton and music and lyrics by Finn Anderson. And it follows the character of Ailey, the last child on the fictional Scottish island of Kinnan, and her encounter with Aaron, a mysterious girl from a floating island of whale herders. Staged entirely with just 2 actors, using live looping technology to build its voicescape, shaped and layered in real time, in a more acute sense than that heard through the high points of Benjamin Button, Islander renders a cappella voice as not only embodied, but elemental, because after all, before instruments, there was only the voice. The opening number, The Splitting of the Islands, recounts a myth of a landmass that split in 2 over time, forcing communities to choose how and where to live, fisher folk and farmers, one island or the other. So that was an end section where the 2 performers, Bethany Tennick and Kirsty Findlay, had built the number using the looping system. So this song enacts voicescaping in 2 ways. First, topographically. Harmonies and motifs rise and fall like cliffs, winds, and tides. The voices don't represent the landscape, they embody the act of dwelling in it and shaping it. And secondly, through temporal layering. Using looping technology, voices are stacked and repeated to form sonic strata like layers of vocal sediment in geological time. As Bender observes, landscapes are never linear but palimpsestic. Sonically, each loop recalls something past, but nonetheless still present in the performance. This is further felt in moments like Finfolk's song, where a sustained drone anchors melodies around it.
From an island that floats beyond the bay comes the sound of an unforgiving song. Shrouded in mist and invisible by day is the land where the Finfolk belong. When the sky is as dark as the deep ocean floor, the mist rolls up through the glen. They come and seduce you and take you from your sleep, never to return home again.
That drone, common in folk traditions, enacts voicescaping by tethering the music to specific times, places, cultures, and traditions, multiple, in fact. This materializes what Bender might call a phenomenological landscape, one felt through Bennett's embodied act of sensory memory, because, as musicologist Thomas Torino notes, this kind of vocal performance fosters participatory listening. Even mediated by technology, the affective act of a vocal drone resonates across times, genres, and cultures, creating a shared emotional situatedness, a sonic heritage, a voicescape. So as with Benjamin Button then, in Islander, the absence of instruments is no lack. It's a sensory concentration which foregrounds Bennett's sense of the embodied affect of unaccompanied voice. Voices sculpt, shape, and scape our entire engagement, building a world rich and ridden with place and time. Watching performers build this voice world live, loop by loop, draws attention to the mechanics of sonic creation, and to how voice entangles with myth, memory, environment, and community, whether across moments, such as in the opening of Benjamin Button, or the entirety of a performance like Islander. So, to use a question I've worked with for the past 10 years to provoke ways into analyses then, what kind of voice is this? Ultimately, in both cases, the act of voicescaping shows us how musical theatre creates and navigates shifting and competing temporalities, crafting time, home, place, and belonging through the layered, embodied, mediated, but unaccompanied voice. Voices don't just tell stories, they are the stories. They make times and landscapes feel audibly like they begin with and belong to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Sort of feel I don't really want to sort of have to enter a sort of space of contemplation after that. I don't want to break that, but you know the drill by now, so we'll take sort of 5 minutes to reflect and to converse and share your thoughts, and then we'll come back for questions. Okay, so that's 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, we need to talk.
Okay, so back again. So can we, again, open the floor to questions? So, looking for... Oh, yeah, one over here. Oh, okay.
Thank you both. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed the session. This is one for Louisa, and it's slightly unthought. So the question goes along the lines of, I was really touched by the negative valency emotion that you were talking about. And we've talked, over the days about a mixture of performing from just sort of just expressing one's voice, using one's voice to express and whatever is expressed. And we've talked about screams being trained. And I feel like there's a question here about how trained do you have to be able to deal with the negative emotion. And I mean, the image that the thought that came to me in terms of teaching was to act drunk on stage. You want to try and be as sober as possible. So I wonder, is there something similar in terms of dealing with negative valency emotion?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. I think there are a couple of sort of elements to that, aren't there? But in terms of how trained to be, my argument is certainly that we need to be more trained to deal with it, both from a vocal perspective and hopefully I've communicated that it's also from an emotional well-being perspective as well. But in terms of the voice specifically, something that's come up quite a lot for me in terms of my interviews with the vocal health practitioners, but also in my own practice, is that within musical theatre specifically, actually here at GSA, the spoken voice training is great, but on a lot of the musical theatre courses, the spoken voice training is quite limited because time is so limited when it comes to musical theatre. And so actually a lot of those kind of extended vocal techniques that we might use for things like yelling and screaming, there is so little time to really work intensively on those extremes in musical theatre, where actually I would say we need it even more because we don't have the space to slow down. We don't have the space to take a pause or to adjust something in the pitch, in the way that we navigate it in the spoken voice. We have so much more freedom with tempo, with rhythm, with pitch, etc. So actually, I feel like the spoken voice training aspect of musical theatre when it comes to extended techniques needs to be significantly more kind of incorporated into our pedagogy. But yeah, there's also the kind of this idea of the emotion regulation. So what seems to happen is that in some cases it will, and it is in some cases, I do want to be clear on that, obviously not everybody experiences this as a significant issue, but particularly in extended periods, if the performer
is also struggling with something else that's going on in their life, or just is particularly has a particular response to it, that initial response, if they don't have good emotion regulation strategies, can then become an ongoing problem that can then become a vocal problem as well as a psychological problem. So I do think it's our responsibility to train them in the whole of the well-being when it comes to this, and to even just have conversations about we're going to be working on this sensitive material. How do you feel about that? Before we even just, give a 19-year-old a piece where her daughter's died or something. We do this all the time, both in non-singing acting work and in musical theatre. But I just think we need to have more conversation. We have intimacy coaches now, right? We have intimacy coaches for dealing with that side of performance, but we don't think about emotional well-being in the same way. So I think it's kind of a two-pronged, the vocal aspect, and I do think that the spoken voice training needs to be a big part of that, and embracing the scream, and even in terms of embodied techniques. I mentioned the Alfred Wolfson, and we heard about Roy Hart, and a lot of those kinds of techniques, we are afforded time to really spend with them in acting courses, but not on musical theatre courses. And I think it's important. So did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
That seems there is a really sort of important thing there about thinking about the word technique as if it's somehow affectless, and it's a technical thing rather than something that involves your whole being.
Exactly.
In that sense.
Yeah.
Is there a question?
Thank you very, very much. This is for Louisa because our work is so connected. It's more of a reflection, so I'm the voice from the long 18th century. And it's very interesting that so many of these issues are being discussed in the long 18th century as well. There's a document from the 1830s which says that Talma specifically triggered the body without feeling in order to act, and that this was what made him a great actor. So these ideas are really, really old. The thing that struck me, and which your paper helped clarify for me, is that very often the context in which emotion is discussed in that period is as a transition. So it's not about being in an affect, but it's about getting to the next one. And I think that might also, the idea that they flow might be something worth exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something that we know from emotion research in the voice is that emotions actually move through the voice very quickly. Often performers will sort of try and do a whole chunk of text in the same emotion, which is actually a mood. That becomes a mood then, because we have this sense of duration. It's not an emotion anymore. So actually, a lot of the work that I've been trialling so far, for example, I have a technique that I use called emotional layering, which is where we take everything back to neutral, and then we use certain sounds and tools that we know that we can hear, we identify as emotion in the listener, so that we start to layer them back on, and we talk about it's likely at some point to trigger an emotional response in the body because we connect. There's a reason why we connect those sounds with emotion, but we talk about it just passing through. And a lot of the problems that we tend to find performers have, and I think it is partly to do with our acting traditions in this country and sort of where they're coming from in terms of, we tend to apply the same acting techniques to singers and we don't adjust. And I don't think that's helpful. But there is often a sort of digging around for emotion and trying to hold on to it. And the more they hold on to it, that's when they're really acting, And so what I'm trying to work with them on is just to kind of go, well, this is what we actually need in order for the audience to be moved. And at this particular point, we can't be doing all of the rest of that. There may be other times where you can experiment and explore in that way, but at this peak vocal demand moment, at this peak emotional demand moment, can we just find these particular sounds that we need to find and allow, yes, those emotional responses to flow through without grabbing them? Yeah.
question over here.
This one's for Ben. We're talking about how you're getting us thinking about all of these a cappella moments in musical theater. And so I have a couple of related questions. One of them is just, is this a trend in more recent musical theater? You pointed to a couple earlier examples, but is this more continuous throughout the history of musical theater in 20th to 21st century? And the second question I had is, I was thinking about song forms and how sometimes you'll have these kinds of dropouts of the instrumentals and it'll go to an a cappella, and often that will happen in something like the bridge, a high impact moment of a song. Do you notice any trends like that, or is there placement of these where it seems especially high point?
Yeah, thank you. So in answer to your first question, this is a trend. So this is something, a trend through the development of the musical, the popular musical form. So I referred earlier to George M. Cohan's Little Johnny Jones. It's not talked about really in the history of Broadway as a popular form. It was the first moment that an actor off stage began singing unaccompanied, comes on, and from that we get Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? So this whole kind of development of that one sequence leads to a song that is now marching bands and parades, right? But it started with an unaccompanied voice. Oklahoma is the kind of paradigmatic example in all textbooks, forever about the musical. It wasn't the first musical. I don't know if people don't know that. Anyway, that's a history lesson for another time. Lady in the Dark, yeah. The little, my ship. It is just repeated throughout until it builds to the final song at the end with the lyrics and the accompaniment. So this does repeat. There is a recurring tradition of a cappella moments in musical theatre. It should be said that thus far in my work there are only 4 completely a cappella musicals. 5 completely a cappella musicals. And they will all be discussed in what is going to be the most long and winding chapter I'll have ever written. But there we go. To answer your second question, is there a difference between kind of the moment where something reaches an apex or a crescendo or a zenith in a song form, so whether it's the coda or whether it's the bridge, is that different to a high point that is the moment of greatest intensity or a demarcation? So I think using a Gawu, what you can end up with is looking both at song forms, but also more broadly at the trajectory of the moment. So if we think more broadly about units, and I mean, I don't want to bring Stanislavski in on a Friday afternoon, but the objective and super objective, right? So what does it do at that moment for that character? So I'm thinking particularly of something like, to stick with musical theatre, Sunset Boulevard, right? So at the very end of Sunset Boulevard, she has just, spoiler alert, shot him. And then the scene where Norma becomes delusional, and I think she's back in the film studio, there is this long extended moment of a cappella. If you look at the dynamic shape of that work, that's not actually the moment of greatest intensity in the show. But it becomes this very inverted moment. So that shift becomes something that is a turning point. So it's a resolution without actually being a resolution. So using the idea of high points from that romantic musicological kind of perspective, you can identify not simply form, but the way that is informed by dramaturgy. So my focus and methodology primarily looks at the dramaturgical impetus for the removal of accompaniment, rather than any trends in song form. Simply because from Weil to Sondheim to Weber, that would be a nightmare. But thank you for your questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Looking at any more questions? Can I have a question. It might be for both of you, but it might be initially for Ben, but Louisa, you might. I was thinking about how the idea that the unaccompanied voice, the solo unaccompanied voice that starts off, has got this kind of sense of sort of purity of presence and interior self and so on. And that, particularly in the last example you were talking about, how once you start layering, then that sort of voice then just turns into sound, becomes sort of impersonal. And I'm just wondering about whether you have any sort of thoughts about that, about the way in which the idea of interior presence, and I'm thinking, I'm connecting it with the idea of soliloquy, I suppose, as being a sort of adjacent area. I don't know, that's not terribly sort of cohesive, but it's just a starting point.
Thank you. Do I have any thoughts about it? Possibly not. However, you raise a good point, which is to say that in something like Islander and in Transit, which is a 2016 Broadway work by the composing team that brought you Let It Go from Frozen, there's a beatboxer at the centre of it. And so actually there is an element of instrumentalised vocality. Yeah. So I think what's interesting about these examples, and the drone maybe is another one, and it's a bit of a conceptual cul-de-sac, right? I'm perhaps straining the gnat in terms of semantics. This is still all based around the idea of the voice that begins, right? The seed of everything else. So my argument goes that it is interior and it is a cappella. It becomes its own accompaniment. So the voice becomes an accompaniment of the voice. In that sense, I think with all musical theatre, there is that imperative of that slightly presentational, self-actualized, emotional kind of declamatory. You know, there's a bright golden haze on the meadow, which was so unexpertly sung just now. You know, it's that moment, isn't it? This is what I need you to know. So it's an interior feeling that is immediately and always externalized. And that emotional kind of 3D that musical theatre, you know, Richard Dyer talks about it in terms of the utopian, right? To have that in a solo, unaccompanied voice is really challenging because it suggests that the external utopic impetus of the musical is actually, there's a corollary there with the internal presence, the monologue, the soliloquy, the reflecting. And I think in the hinterland between those two drives is this really interesting moment. And there are other case studies that I will look at that very much try and just sit in that in-between space, the vocal in-between, and tease out what that is. So thank you for the question. I think it's somewhere else I need to go, particularly acknowledging that if there's a drone, technically there's an instrument, but as it's voices, I'm going to call it quits and say it's a cappella.
Louisa, does that speak to you?
I guess I would just the idea of the a cappella solo voice being externalized feels slightly odd to me, because to me that's such an intimate moment between the singer and the audience, and so it feels strange to call that external, because it feels like such a personal exchange and communication when we have just the voice and nothing else. And then when you add a layer of harmony, that becomes an incredibly intimate moment of voice and breath between you and another human being. So it doesn't feel other, it feels intimate to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Oh, there's a question over here.
In your presentation, you talked about the affective emotion on the voice, mostly in a way that restricts expression. Is there any research onto? I think this might be two questions, but are there senses in which the affective emotion on the voice can be harnessed to express things, especially if those patterns have been written into the music in certain ways?
Yeah, I mean, lots of positive emotions actually have a really positive effect on the voice, because again, it has a positive impact on our whole well-being. You know, the body responds really positively to that. And there are ways, and this comes back to what I was talking about in terms of the affective athleticism, there are embodied techniques where we can embrace the scream and we can use cathartic voicing. But I do believe that needs very specific training. Not just, and when I say training, it comes back to what Robert said about technique. I don't just mean that in a technical sense. It's not about sitting there and sort of giving it these tiny little tweaks and things like that in a technical sense. It's training in terms of training in that very dated word, craft. You know, I do think it's something that you have to be open to and to work on and to build over time. I've totally sidetracked myself. Have I answered you at all? Yes. And
Okay. I think, unless there are any final questions, I think we're out of time. Oh, one more. Yeah.
Yes. Do I need a microphone? No, I don't. So yes, thank you very much for both presentations. They were very beautiful. I have a question for Ben regarding sampling, the art of sampling, the practice of sampling. In particular, as you may know, the a cappella sampling, which is this very peculiar kind of material that is just the vocal track is removed digitally and selected, so you can. Oh, okay, that's okay. Hello. Hey. So a cappella samples are just vocal tracks that are digitally removed from the music. So you remove the bass and you just have the voice, and there are huge archives of these files. And it's a very particular form of listening, because you can listen to just the voice of a song that was not produced to be listened that way. Those voices were not produced to be listened alone, but they are very beautiful to listen to, because there's something magical about having this opportunity. And I wanted to ask you, how do you locate this kind of material in relationship to voicescaping? What kind of voicescaping happens?
Wow. Thanks, Francesco. No, it's a great question. Yeah, I think, in those instances, we're talking here about kind of the material archive of sound, aren't we? I think there's something about the sonic rather than the vocal, because of the intention of what it is we're listening to. So listening to that idea of kind of the sonic trace of something that had or has in its normal context a much more full and rounded shape asks us, I think, to do two things. It asks us to listen more particularly to the quality of the voice, which, if it has been treated in any way and mediated in any way, and then those things are removed, fundamentally it's Rick Altman, right? The illusion of presence. So we're not hearing necessarily the voice as it would be live. And I think that's one thing to say, is that the idea of scaping then becomes digital and mediated in a way that, even though all performers in the examples that I use have throat mics, head mics, or handheld mics, it's a different mediation. So liveness and mediation, I think, are the two things that change what it is that's sculpted in those cases. It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, so I'm just sort of thinking out loud. But yeah, let's talk more. That's a great question.
I think
thank you.
Yeah, let's talk more. That's a good time to break. So thank you again to the two great papers. And great time.
There is fresh coffee outside and we are back in less than 20 minutes. So for the round table. Yes, thank you.